Due Process, winner of 25 Regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
The force of what was really going on throughout the entire country had made the situation at that point uncontrollable.
The activist who analyzed Newark's game-changing rebellion nearly 30 years ago, now author of what may be the city's definitive political history. It's called Inside Newark, and Inside Newark is where Bob Curvin's been for nearly all his life. As activist, academic, Princeton PhD, and one-time member of the New York Times Editorial Board. He's witnessed, worked on, and now written about Newark's decline, rebellion, and search for transformation. And he's our only guest on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation.
It's been a symbol of white flight, black unrest, urban blight, poverty, corruption for decades. And everyone has an opinion about Newark, even people who've never been there. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King. I've lived and worked in Newark, covered the city, its social, economic, political life for all of my career. So I can attest that when my old friend and one-time teacher Bob Curvin writes a book about our city, he writes it from inside Newark.
Even some of the darkest stories have another side of effort and hope to make Newark a better place.
And a better Newark is what Bob Curvin's been working on for most of his 80 years.
Every gain of that kind was made with an enormous amount of struggle.
Challenging Newark business, demanding an integrated workforce.
We even picketed White Castle on Elizabeth Avenue because White Castle would not hire black waitresses.
Fighting plans for a sprawling med school.
That was going to lead to the displacement of something like 10% of the entire population of the city.
Contesting police brutality.
I can remember in many cases, many people saying to me and other members of CORE that, you really better be careful criticizing the police because it's very, very dangerous.
And trying to calm tensions in the summer of '67.
The force of what was really going on throughout the entire country had made the situation at that point uncontrollable. And there were a whole series of issues about race and poverty and police mistreatment in the city. It was a very serious problem.
That was Bob with me, remembering the Newark Rebellion in 1987.
A lot of people would like to define Newark and Newarkers by 1967.
And again in 2007.
I think it's really important, I agree, for young people to know about the riot, or the rebellion, or the revolution, whatever it was to them. But I also think it's important for them to know about other things about Newark's history.
And the riot is just one theme of Bob Curvin's Inside Newark. Decline, rebellion, and transformation.
Did you see your name in the book? Yeah. You did.
Launched at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center.
Sit down, please. I'm going to get a big ego with all this attention.
Before an audience in the hundreds, who stood patiently in line to have a longtime local hero sign their books.
Did you make a list of all your comments? Can I have it?
You know, the book really represents what Bob is. It's about leadership. It's about integrity. It's about honesty.
Bob's book presents a grim narrative of Newark over the last 50 years.
In fact, the book covers less of Curvin's extraordinary career. Rutgers Prof, New School Dean, Ford Foundation VP, New York Times Editorial Board, and less even of his own activism than the story of his city, its politics, its leaders, its poverty.
No major urban city in this country carries the burden of so many poor people in the way that Newark does.
And what does that mean?
Congratulations, Mayor!
For Newark's future.
I just wanted to say that I think that there is reason to hope. The history, the legacy, the external problems that a city like Newark has to face are really tremendous. And they're not going to change overnight. They're not going to change even maybe in 50 years. But this is really quite a uplifting, inspiring showing of our potential strength. And I want to thank you for being here. Stay here? Okay.
Bob, I got my copy of this very fine book from you in a diner shortly after it was published.
Right.
You wrote an inscription, and I started reading it right away. And that was before I learned you were going to be with us. Sandy said, "Oh, we got Bob." So the interesting question is that you talk about the search for transformation, and yet in that clip you're talking about hope.
Hope.
And it seems to me that there are a lot of obstacles to transformation that you discuss in this book.
Right.
Challenges of race and class and poverty.
Right.
The small size of Newark that people don't talk about.
Right.
Which of those is the biggest obstacle to the kind of transformation about which you're hopeful, but clearly isn't here yet, or you wouldn't be talking still about a search for transformation?
Well, it's obviously poverty. It's the not only poverty per se, but deep poverty. If you look at the data on some neighborhoods in Newark, we're talking about people 50%, families 50% below the poverty level that are only living on $13,000, $14,000 a year, which is virtually impossible in this global, highly technical, complicated world. And so you have to ask, what can you do about that? You know, it affects everything in the city. It affects crime, it affects housing, and it surely affects education. It affects the politics of the city, because to really engage a citizen in a way that a citizen deserves to be engaged, they have to be somewhat free of the economic burdens that make you have to hold 3 jobs or have to make you sit in the welfare office half the day.
Why does the poverty remain endemic? We've got a huge airport, it's a railhead, it's adjacent to a great port, and it has its own great port.
Right.
Why would those not be recipes, a formula for dragging itself out of poverty, as you say, per se, and also people who are in the deep poverty out?
Well, I would say that you hit a very, very important point, which I talk about in the book. But the reality is that the elements of exclusion and discrimination are longstanding, and they've had a very, very deep effect on a community that's even adjacent to those opportunities. So you have that to deal with discrimination. Then you have to look internally at what we have to offer. And the Heldrick Center at Rutgers did a very interesting study a few years ago looking at what various employers really look for in those particular areas, the airport, the seaport. I think they looked at Elizabeth as well. And what many of the managers said was that we have trouble finding young people who even know how to deal with customers and people who come in to work with. He said, we can teach the skills. We can teach the computer skills. We can teach how to compute a bill or something like that. But if you're not prepared to really take on the civic rules of how business works, how society works, then you're not prepared for the workforce. And we, unfortunately, this is a problem of family. It's a problem of neighborhood. It's also a problem of schooling.
I wonder, Bob, is it also a problem because your book doesn't begin in the 60s? It
Right.
begins long before that.
Right.
You point out that Newark, unlike other major cities,
Right.
didn't become Greater Newark,
Right.
didn't incorporate the towns around it.
Right.
Vailsburg, you say, was the
Right.
one town, and that's where you live now
That's where I
in
live
Newark.
now, right.
But Newark then became this separate entity, and as its problems grew,
Yeah. It
and
became more difficult to deal with it.
It became more
Yeah.
difficult. So
Yeah.
when we're looking at something that's that endemic,
Yeah.
what's the way out?
There may not be a way out because the way in which the cities, the jurisdictions of New Jersey are so fragmented and so tightly bound is a virtually death knell for many urban communities. I'm talking about Trenton as well as Patterson and Elizabeth and Irvington, Orange. In another state, like Maryland, for example, Baltimore has a very well-off suburban ring around it. Philadelphia, which was able to annex quite aggressively in the early 1900s, also has.
Well, we have a well-off
size.
suburban ring too. It's just not
It's
part.
not part of our city.
Our city.
So if you
regionalization's been talked about forever, and we've not seen any sign of it.
who's going to raise their hand for regionalization?
But that comes really to the other part, because I was struck by Sandy,
Right.
like Sandy,
Right.
she's never struck me,
Right.
by your description of the small size of Newark compared to
Right.
capital
Because
cities
in
elsewhere.
other cities,
And you also
yeah.
have entities like the Port Authority that take even more rateables out of the footprint
Right.
and the airport.
Right.
So then the question turns to leadership, because obviously, how do we bring together the various ethnic groups that constitute Newark and then relate to the outer communities?
Yeah.
And this is a book going back from Longys Wilman
Right.
to the now in the Senate, Cory Booker.
Right.
And it seems to me that while you talk about a lot of remarkable people who we either know or know of, who are geniuses of a sort,
Right.
but at the end of the day, what's the reason for hoping that within that long history, now where we are, there is some kind of genius that can lead to collective leadership that drags Newark out of its trap?
Yeah.
It's small template.
Well, I'm committed to this notion that you have to have hope, or otherwise, you run away. And I do think that there's slack in the system. This is a very, very difficult time for the world, for the state government, for the national government. There's no money, there are very few resources. I point out that HUD is virtually non-existent in comparison to what it was in the 60s.
But let me just
and
push
70s.
this point about leadership. You talk, interestingly enough, in the very last chapter about Bayard Rustin, who I agree with you
Right.
is not often talked about,
Right.
who talked about a nonviolent revolutionary approach. And you
Right.
mentioned two people, Donald Tucker and Donald Payne,
Right.
as sort of approaching that model.
Right.
Why do you mention those two, and is there anybody currently alive who you think fits that model?
Yeah. Well, again, hope. But let me finish the
Okay,
last question
sure.
first, because I want to make this point about the slack in the system. I think that what leadership does, in fact, this is my ultimate point, what leadership does is extremely significant. Even in the worst of times, there are opportunities to make the city feel better about itself and for other people to feel better about the city. Corruption poisons visions and hope. Bad behavior, violence, ruins the reputation of the city. It creates fear. It makes commerce and development more complicated, more difficult. Some of those things can be done locally without massive resources coming in.
And yet you point out, other than the two nods that you gave to the two Donalds, that Newark has had lousy leadership.
Well, I would say, I didn't use the word lousy.
No,
but,
actually.
But I said disappointing.
You said worse than lousy, Bob. You said in talking about both Kenneth Gibson and Sharp James, you said both eventually joined Newark's long tradition of petty deal-making by operating close to or outside of the boundaries of legality.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty strong.
Well,
for both, you say the school district was about jobs and patronage, not the future of Newark's children.
I like
that's
what
terrible.
I wrote. I like what I wrote.
So that's...
but I think lousy is just too amorphous and nondescriptive. But the point is that they were disappointing because I think they had the wherewithal to do better. And just as I feel the same way about Cory Booker. I think that he could have done better for the city.
And you say, why do you feel that he failed?
Well, I think he failed many scores, but I think there were certainly positive things that he did.
Right, but you say that he didn't have his eye on Newark, that his eye was always at the next step.
Always on where he was going. And Sharp called it right from the beginning. He said, this guy is here to use our city as a stepping stone. Well, as you know, one of the civic leaders in Newark said to me, well, I like somebody, you know, who's ambitious and is going to use us as a stepping stone. That means he's going to do good for us. Well, I don't think we got that payoff.
But so, talking about leadership in the book, one of the interesting things, and again, I like going back to Longy's Woman, and is to look at each mayor, for example, but look at the kinds of people they've drawn to them. Because at each point, the question is, no mayor is going to do everything. But what's the quality of the people they draw to them?
That's right.
And in each case, I'd have to say that you assess a failure to draw people who are vibrant and with roots in the community who have a desire to take Newark to the next level. Is that unique to Newark?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think if you go back to Gibson, some of the bright young people stayed around for a while. Even Dennis Sullivan? Even Dennis Sullivan, you know, after a while. And when I interviewed Dennis, and I was shocked because I thought, in fact, that they had this father-son kind of relationship in a way. But he was extremely disappointed when he came back to the city after 2 years in Oxford and found that the people that we were trying to get out, were now trekking in City Hall, and many of them had critical positions and were calling, as he says, they were calling the shots. And as Anthony Imperiali, he said, when one of Adonisia's former guys was given a job by Ken Gibson, he said, what is that guy doing at City Hall? He should be in jail with the rest of those people. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that happened.
You also talk about Ken Gibson, who was the first black mayor and who came out of an interesting coalition, one that I think we haven't really had since, and then rejecting many of the people who were involved in that effort, especially our current mayor's father, Amiri Baraka.
Right. Well, in fairness to Mayor Gibson, I think some of us were very idealistic, and we had expectations about the role of government, the possibilities, and so on, that were very lofty, but they were not realistic.
No one was going to meet those.
Right. So I think that was a problem for him, and I don't think he had the character and the skills to manage that. He didn't even relate very well to the business community. My interview with the departed Gus Hinningberg spells this out very critically. I said to him, well, Gus, why were you such an important figure in dealing with the business community? He said, because Mayor Gibson didn't know how.
So I come back to where I was earlier, which is this is a book that is almost encyclopedic and touching on all of the people that I knew over the years, the people I knew about.
Right.
And it seems to me at the end of the day, although your personality seems to be driven towards hope,
Right.
it's hard to see in your analysis something structural that's going to produce a generation of leaders in the immediate future that have the kind of vision that you talk about that can lead to the transformation you hope for.
Yeah.
But maybe there's more than your personality that you hope, but I want to know.
Well, it's not my personality.
Okay.
But I think it's some fortune and some good hard work that I think can get us to a better place. And I'm encouraged that several people have already picked up this idea of trying to create more civic engagement in the city. And Rutgers in particular is now running these conversations about critical issues. We have a very tough challenge in getting local people to participate. But I think that can be done in time. But the idea that they've adopted this idea that there has to be an ongoing conversation about many of these critical issues that the government deals with, but usually by themselves. The citizens are not very much into the conversation.
Nancy Cantor, the chancellor
Yeah.
of Newark Rutgers.
Right.
Is this who you see as the person who can make this happen? She
Well,
certainly seems willing to.
She's she's an urban gem in a way, and what I've seen thus far is a very savvy, smart, and caring chief administrator on the Newark campus. We had Steve Diner before, who was absolutely terrific, but I think Nancy brings the similar type of energy and concern about the city. I was very pleased that she joined Roz Baraka's transition committee.
We're looking now at the optimistic Bob.
Right.
But the less optimistic Bob was
Okay.
the person who said to that group at NJPAC when asked, when, how, you said, well, I think something good is going to happen. It may take 50 years.
Right.
50 years.
Right. Yeah, I was trying to look out when I won't be around. But
it's going to take that long?
Yeah, it shouldn't take that long. I was trying to be, I guess, hard-nosed and realistic about what change is about.
But let me move away from managing expectations. If you were given the power to make one change with respect to Newark, would it be that notion of broadening the political and economic boundaries so that everything from East Orange and maybe west in Essex County, the area surrounding it, became more integrated into the life of Newark? Is that where you would go?
That would be a good first choice, but it's not the only first choice that would be on the table. One of the other first choices would be sitting down with representatives from Congress, our senators, the corporate leadership of the state, and saying, how do we put together a work program that anybody can work that shows up?
And is there a will to do that in any of those entities?
No, there's not. But, that's one of the things.
We just gave them unlimited power, remember?
Well, that's one of the things we have to drive for. Without it, I think that hope is denied.
Bob, you're one of the people who didn't leave Newark when he could.
Right.
You could have left Newark 40 years ago easily.
Mm-hmm.
You've chosen to stay.
Yeah.
Why?
I find Newark.
30 seconds.
I find Newark very a good place to be. There's a challenge, but there's some wonderful people in the city. I have great friends. I like living 20 minutes from the airport. I like being close to New York. I like being a Newarker. There's a history here. My family, grew up in Newark. We've been Newarkers in a way for many years,
And Bob, although I wish
Okay,
we
we're
had
out of
more
time.
time,
Okay.
that is it for this edition
Right.
of Due Process. But your book has sparked new thinking,
Yes.
new discussion about Newark, and that will go on.
As will Due
Yes,
Process.
indeed.
So we
Right.
hope that you'll join us next week and every week on 13 or NJTV or online on demand at dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. For Sandy and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
Why I wrote the book, because I wanted to tell my story, and I wanted it to be fair and balanced, and I appreciate that leadership is challenging, that it's not an easy thing to be the mayor of a city or a member of the city council, that the challenges are complicated, they require dedication, willingness to work hard, sensitivities that do not necessarily come easily. And while I may seem quite critical of some of the leaders that we've had, I've also tried to be fair.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.